What if the greatest mistake in galactic history wasn't a war, but a vote? 217 alien civilizations, one chamber, one unanimous decision, and not a single one of them understood what they had just done. The grand hall of the Galactic Conclave was a cathedral of light, suspended above the gas giant Frenvok, its walls humming with the translated voices of species who had never once agreed on anything until today. Today, they agreed on humanity. Resolution 7 Omega. On the surface, it read like bureaucratic language, a reclassification of affiliate labor populations under Conclave Statute 12. In practice, it meant something far darker. Humans, every engineer, doctor, technician, and pilot who spent the last 40 years serving the galaxy's furthest colonies, were no longer citizens with contracts. They were resources, property of the Conclave, to be assigned, relocated, and disciplined as the member worlds saw fit. The vote passed 217 to 0. In the human observation gallery, one man did not gasp. He did not stand. He did not protest. His name was Colin Ward, senior diplomat of the Earth mission, and he had spent 11 years building the very trust the Conclave had just shredded in 11 minutes. When the final vote tallied on the great display, silence fell across the human delegation, and then, into that silence, Ward simply closed a folder in front of him. A junior aide leaned toward him and whispered, "Ambassador, what's our rebuttal?" Ward looked at her with something that wasn't anger. It was pity. "There isn't one," he said. "You don't argue with someone who has already decided you're not a person." The Conclave delegates expected fury. They expected threats, lawsuits, appeals to sentiment. Species like the Threll and the Corvette had drafted contingency statements for exactly that. Statements designed to make humanity look petty, emotional, ungrateful for the opportunities the galaxy had given them. Instead, Ward stood, gathered his materials, and walked to the podium one final time. "The Earth mission thanks the Conclave for its clarity," he said. His voice did not shake. "You have told us exactly what we are worth to you. We accept your assessment." He paused. "We're going home." No one in that chamber understood the weight of those 4 words. "Not yet." The thrilled delegate actually laughed, a wet, clicking sound of amusement. "Home," he repeated to his neighbor, as if Earth could survive without its trade contracts. As if the little apes have anywhere else to go. Laughter rippled through sections of the gallery. It was, several observers would later admit, the last time anyone found the situation funny. Within 6 hours, the Earth Embassy on Frenvok was empty. Its staff had packed nothing but personal effects. Server logs, contracts, medical databases. Every piece of infrastructure that belonged to Earth was formally, legally, and irreversibly withdrawn, exactly as Conclave law permitted a sovereign non-member state to do. They didn't slam the door. They didn't even lock it. They simply turned off the lights and left the key inside. What almost no one in that chamber realized, what only a handful of xeno-economists across 217 worlds had ever bothered to calculate, was how deep the roots of human labor had grown into galactic civilization, not as soldiers, not as conquerors, as the quiet, reliable hands that kept the machinery of 1,000 worlds turning. That evening, on a mining colony orbiting a dead star 11,000 light-years from Earth, a message arrived on every human terminal simultaneously. It was brief. It carried no threats, no instructions, no political language at all. Effective immediately, all Earth mission personnel are recalled. Contracts are void. Come home. It was sign only. See Ward, Earth Mission. 12,000 humans read that message in the same hour. And every single one of them, in workshops and hospitals, in control towers and reactor cores, began, quietly, calmly, without a single act of sabotage or defiance, to pack their bags. The Conclave had just voted to own humanity. Humanity had already left the building. They expected riots. They got silence. And silence was so much worse. On the industrial world of Keswick Prime, the morning shift at the Vantral Fabrication Complex began exactly as it always had, except that of the 400 human technicians who calibrated the plasma forges, only 6 showed up. The rest had already boarded transport shuttles bound for the nearest Earth charter vessel. Their resignation notices filed with the exact legal precision the Conclave itself had written into its own labor codes. Supervisor Drath Austin, a Corvette manager who had spent 15 years dismissing human workers as adequate but replaceable, stood in the empty calibration bay and realized, for the first time, that he did not actually know how to run the forges without them. He tried anyway. Within 4 hours, Forge Line 3 overheated and shut down. Within 6, Lines 1 and 2 followed. By the end of the first day, the Vantral Complex, one of the largest fabrication plants in the Outer Rim, had produced nothing, not a single unit. Austin filed an emergency labor request to the Conclave Placement Bureau. The answer came back within the hour. There was no backup workforce. There had never needed to be one. Humans had always filled that gap. The pattern repeated across the galaxy with terrifying speed. On the medical station orbiting Vayseti, 3 of the station's 5 trauma surgeons were human. All 3 departed within 48 hours of the recall message, each leaving behind meticulous handover notes that explained procedures no other species on staff had ever been trained to perform. The station's automated systems could stabilize patients. They could not operate. A Threll patient with a ruptured secondary heart died on the operating table 4 days later, not from any human failure, but from the absence of one. News of the death spread through conclave media as a tragedy of human abandonment. Editorials on a dozen worlds accused Earth of weaponizing compassion, of holding the galaxy hostage by simply leaving. It was an argument that revealed, more than anything else, how completely the alien worlds had assumed humans owed them their labor as a matter of course. The military dimension arrived next, and it terrified the Conclave more than any hospital ever could. The Joint Defense Fleet station near the Ashvara border, a fleet built from 7 different species technology, stitched together by human systems engineers because no other species had ever developed compatible integration software, began reporting critical failures. Fighter wings couldn't sync targeting arrays. Capital ships lost real-time coordination between Allied vessels. Admiral Threx Kalorn, a decorated Ashvin commander, discovered that the fleet's entire communication backbone had been designed, built, and maintained by a human contracting firm that had just formally dissolved its conclave charter. He grounded 18 warships rather than risk deploying a fleet that might turn against itself mid-battle. For the first time in conclave history, a military alliance had been rendered inoperable not by an enemy attack, but by the simple absence of the people who understood how it worked. Back on Earth, none of this triggered celebration. Colin Ward watched the reports arrive with the same measured stillness he'd shown in the Grand Hall. He had not called for the recall to punish anyone. He had called for it because he refused to let human beings continue working under a legal status that stripped them of personhood. And the collapse that followed was not vengeance. It was simply what happened when you discovered, all at once, exactly how much weight a set of hands had been carrying. Then came the message that truly rattled the conclave leadership. A joint council of 11 mid-tier species, worlds that had quietly resented the dominance of Threll and Corvette voting blocs for decades, sent a private communication to the Earth mission. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't a demand. It was a question, cautious and almost embarrassed in tone. We did not vote for Resolution 7 Omega of our own will. We were pressured by the majority bloc. Is there a path back to the old contracts? For us, specifically? Ward read the message twice. Then he called Earth's newly formed Recovery Council into session for the first time and said 6 words that would define the next phase of the crisis. Not yet. Let them feel it. One by one, the lights across the galaxy began to flicker, and no army could fix it. By the 3rd week after Resolution 7 Omega, the crisis had a name across conclave media. The silence. Not because humanity had gone quiet. Earth's public statements remained calm, factual, and infrequent. But because everywhere humans had once been, an unnerving stillness had taken their place. On the desert world of Corvain September, the great atmospheric water reclamation towers, a human-engineered system installed 40 years earlier to save a dying colony, began drifting out of calibration. No human remained on-site to perform the delicate, weekly adjustments the machinery required. Local engineers, brilliant in their own right, had simply never been taught the process. The original contract had specified human oversight as a permanent fixture, cheaper and more reliable than training an entirely new discipline from scratch. Reclamation output dropped 9% in a week, then 15%. Colony administrators, panicking, offered triple wages to any human willing to return. Not one accepted. It wasn't stubbornness. It was structural. Earth's Recovery Council had issued a single, galaxy-wide directive to every citizen still holding a conclave work visa. Any human who chose to return under the old terms would be doing so as property, not an employee, under the very law the conclave had just passed. No bonus, no plea, no threat could change that legal fact. The conclave had built the cage. Now it was discovering that no one wanted to walk back inside it, no matter what was offered. Financial markets across the trade-linked worlds began to shudder. The Corvette Central Exchange, long considered the most stable currency hub in the galaxy, saw a 14% single-day drop when 3 major shipping conglomerates announced they could no longer guarantee delivery schedules. Their entire logistics routing software had been maintained under contract by a human firm based in Nairobi that had ceased all off-world operations overnight. Politicians who had cheered Resolution 7 Omega just weeks earlier now faced furious constituents standing in unlit streets, holding spoiled food from failed refrigeration units, demanding answers no one had. The Thrall Assembly, architects of the original resolution, tried the one lever they still believed they had: force. A Thrall enforcement vessel was dispatched to a human-crewed orbital shipyard near the Assembly's home system, under the pretense of ensuring continuity of essential conclave infrastructure. Its captain carried orders that were legal under Resolution 7 Omega, but morally indistinguishable from a hostage-taking, detained key human personnel until they agreed to resume operations. The shipyard's remaining human staff didn't resist. They didn't need to. The moment the enforcement vessel docked, every human employee simply invoked their Earth citizenship and requested immediate evacuation under interstellar civilian protection treaties the Thrall themselves had signed decades earlier, treaties written long before anyone imagined they'd ever be used this way. Refusing evacuation would have been an act of open aggression against a neutral world, broadcast across every conclave news network within the hour. The Thrall captain, humiliated, was forced to grant it. Every human left the shipyard within 6 hours. The yard produced nothing for the rest of the month. It was the first time the galaxy openly saw what Earth had been quietly proving all along, that you could pass any law you wanted, but you could not legislate away a person's right to walk out the door. And then, almost invisibly at first, something else began happening. Species that had never spoken up in the conclave, smaller worlds, junior members, cultures who had watched Resolution 7 Omega pass with quiet unease, began issuing individual statements distancing themselves from it. A young Vayseti senator gave a speech that was clipped and shared across a dozen networks. We called them replaceable. They were never replaceable. We were simply the ones who never had to notice. For the first time since the vote, the conclave's unanimous front was cracking. And on Earth, a small legal team working out a converted embassy building in Geneva was quietly finishing something far more devastating than any protest could ever be: an invoice. Earth wasn't preparing for war. It was preparing a bill, and it would bankrupt an empire. The document was 4,000 pages long, and it had taken Earth's legal team 11 days to compile using nothing but the conclave's own statutes. Its title was almost comically bureaucratic: Formal Claim for Retroactive Compensation under Conclave Labor Equity Statutes 4 through 19, filed by the Sovereign Earth Mission. Its content was not comical at all. Led Council Amaro say had spent 6 years working within the conclave's legal apparatus before the vote, cataloging something almost no alien species had ever bothered to examine closely: the actual value of human labor under conclave's own fair market compensation laws. Laws designed originally to protect alien workers from exploitation by other alien employers. Laws humanity had simply been folded into as an afterthought decades earlier. For 40 years, human contract had been quietly, systematically underpaid relative to conclave equity standards, not through any single dramatic theft, but through thousands of small administrative shortcuts, currency conversion tricks, and affiliate labor classifications that had never quite qualified humans for protections other species enjoyed. Individually, each violation was almost trivial, multiplied across 40 years and 11 million human workers, spread over 217 worlds. The total came to a number so large that when Osei first ran the calculation, She made her assistant verify it 3 separate times before she believed it herself. The invoice was delivered not through diplomatic back channels, but publicly, filed simultaneously with the Conclave Judiciary Court, and released to every major news network across alien space within the same hour. There was no negotiation opening, no polite cover letter, just a number and the law laid side by side. The reaction was immediate and seismic. Conclave markets, already shaken by weeks of labor disruption, went into freefall as economists across a dozen worlds independently confirmed the same horrifying truth. The claim was legally sound. Every citation traced back to statutes the Conclave itself had authored and enforced against its own member species for decades. Earth wasn't asking for charity or an apology or a symbolic gesture. It was asking the Conclave to follow its own laws. Laws so airtight that refusing to honor them would require the Conclave to publicly admit its entire legal framework was a sham built to protect everyone except the species it depended on most. Threll Treasury officials tried to argue jurisdiction, that Earth, as a non-member state, had no standing to file under Conclave statute. Osei had anticipated exactly that argument and buried a rebuttal on page 340. Earth had never withdrawn from the treaties governing labor compensation, only from the political body that had voted to reclassify its people. The compensation claim stood on its own, independent of Conclave membership, precisely because the underpayment had occurred while humans held full legal standing, before Resolution 7 Omega had ever existed. It was, several commentators noted, almost elegant in its cruelty. The Conclave had spent weeks trying to prove humans were disposable resources. Now it was being forced to prove in open court exactly how much value those disposable resources had actually generated and how much it had been quietly stolen. 3 days after the filing, the Corvette Banking Consortium, the single largest holder of Conclave-wide currency reserves, issued a private warning to Assembly leadership that would leak to the press within hours if the claim was contested and lost in court, as their own legal analysts believed was overwhelmingly likely the resulting mandatory compensation payout would trigger the largest economic contraction in Conclave history. Several member worlds, they warned, might not survive intact. For the first time since the vote on Resolution 7 Omega, the Grand Hall convened an emergency session, not to discuss humanity's punishment, but to discuss whether the Conclave itself could survive the consequences of what it had done. Colin Ward, watching the footage from Earth, allowed himself the first small, quiet smile since the day he closed that folder and walked away. The galaxy that voted as one now scrambled to save itself and turn on each other. The emergency session of the Grand Hall was nothing like the one that had passed Resolution 7 Omega. There was no unanimous vote this time. There was shouting. The Threll delegation, still clinging to the fiction that the crisis was a temporary labor dispute, proposed a hardline response. Formally declare Earth's invoice an act of economic aggression, and freeze all Earthling financial assets across Conclave banks in retaliation. It was a desperate, almost childish gesture, and it revealed exactly how little the old guard understood the position they were in. The proposal lasted less than an hour before the Corvette banking bloc killed it outright. Freezing Earth's assets, their representatives explained through gritted teeth, would do nothing to Earth, whose economy had never been deeply entangled with Conclave currency to begin with, but would instead trigger immediate, catastrophic loss of confidence in every Conclave financial institution simultaneously, since it would prove to every trading partner in the galaxy that the Conclave was willing to seize assets by decree whenever it felt threatened. 3 smaller trade worlds threatened to withdraw their reserves within the hour if the Threll proposal moved forward. The vote to retaliate failed, 89 to 128. It was the first major vote the Threll bloc had lost in over a decade. What followed was uglier than any battle: recrimination. Delegate after delegate rose to distance themselves from a resolution they had, only weeks earlier, voted for unanimously. The Ve Seti representative reminded the chamber that her government had privately warned against the labor reclassification months before the vote. The Junior Species Coalition, the same 11 worlds that quietly reached out to Earth weeks before, now spoke openly, accusing the Threll and Corvette blocs of having drafted Resolution 7 Omega without meaningful consultation, steamrolling smaller members into a unanimous vote through backroom pressure and blackmail over trade quotas. It was into this fracturing chamber that a new figure stepped forward. Not a diplomat, but a Threll shipping magnate named Vesic Thorn, whose fortune depended entirely on trade routes now crippled by the silence. Thorn did something no Conclave leader had dared do yet. He publicly apologized, not to the Assembly, to Earth. In a broadcast statement carried across every major network, he stated plainly that his own company's collapse, 3 bankrupt subsidiaries in 11 days, was a direct result of policies built on the arrogant assumption that human expertise was interchangeable with anyone else's. "We did not lose a labor force," he said. "We lost the only species in this galaxy that ever actually wanted to help us, and we told them they weren't people while they did it." It was the single most quoted alien statement of the entire crisis, and it broke something loose in the wider public conversation. Protests, small but growing, began appearing on Threll and Corveth worlds, not in support of Earth exactly, but against a government that had gambled the galaxy's stability on a vote no one had actually thought through. Facing collapsing markets, a legally unbeatable invoice, a military alliance that could no longer coordinate itself, and now open rebellion within its own ranks, the Conclave leadership did the only thing left available to them. Assembly Speaker Corveth Vantal, the very delegate who had gabbled Resolution 7 Omega into law, requested, through back channels, a private communication with Colin Ward. Ward received the request in his small Geneva office, read it twice, and set it down on his desk without immediately responding. His aide asked whether he'd accept. "Not yet," Ward said again, the same 2 words he'd used weeks before. But this time he added something more. "Draft the terms first. When we finally talk to them, I want to walk in already knowing exactly what we're worth. Not what they think we're worth. What we actually are." The galaxy came to beg and found the door already open, on humanity's terms. The delegation that arrived on Earth 3 weeks later bore little resemblance to the one that had voted 217-0 in the Grand Hall. It was smaller, quieter. Speaker Corveth Vantal himself led it, flanked not by triumphant allies but by anxious economic advisors carrying briefcases full of objections that all pointed toward the same conclusion. Without a resolution, at least 40 Conclave member worlds faced infrastructure collapse within the year. They landed in Geneva under an overcast sky, expecting, many of them privately admitted afterward, to be made to wait, to be lectured, to be humiliated the way the Grand Hall had once humiliated Earth's own delegation. Instead, Colin Ward met them at the door himself, alone, without an entourage of aides or a wall of security. He shook Vandal's hand, an alien gesture Ward had learned decades earlier, and one Vantal clearly hadn't expected to be offered, and said only, "Come in. Let's talk like equals this time." It unsettled the delegation more than any show of force could have. They had come prepared for anger. They found, instead, a species that had simply stopped needing their approval. The negotiations that followed over the next 9 days were, by every account, unlike anything in Conclave diplomatic history. There was no posturing, no theatrical walkouts. Earth's team, led by Ward and Osei together, laid out 3 conditions, plainly and without room for renegotiation. First, full, immediate repeal of Resolution 7 Omega, with an explicit written acknowledgement that no species could ever again be classified as property under Conclave law, a clause that would protect not just humans, but every minor species who might one day face the same vote. Second, the compensation claim will proceed exactly as filed, in full, paid over a structure decade-long schedule Earth's own economists had designed specifically to avoid collapsing the worlds that owed it. Third, and this was a condition that visibly shook the alien delegation most, any future labor agreement between Earth and any Conclave world will be negotiated individually, government to government, worker protections included from the first clause, never again folded into a blanket statute written by others without a single human voice in the room. On the 7th day, the talks nearly broke down entirely when a hardline Threll advisor, still unable to accept a shift in power, attempted one final tactic. He suggested that Earth's compensation claim be reduced in exchange for restored priority trade status, dangling economic favor, as though it were still the more valuable currency in the room. Osei didn't even raise her voice. She simply opened her briefcase, placed a single page on the table, and slid it across. It was a leaked internal Corveth banking memo, the same one warning of galactic economic collapse if the claim went unpaid, now stamped with formal notice that Earth's legal team had already filed it as supporting evidence with the Conclave Judiciary Court should negotiations fail. The message was unmistakable. Earth did not need favorable trade status. Earth had already won the argument, in writing, using the Conclave's own words. The hardline advisor was quietly removed from the delegation by his own government within 48 hours. By the 9th day, the terms were signed. Every clause Earth had proposed stood exactly as written. But it was what happened after the signing that the history archives will remember longest. As the delegates prepared to depart, Speaker Van Tal lingered behind, alone with Ward in the quiet embassy hall where it had all effectively ended. He asked a question that had haunted the entire conclave for months. "You never fired a shot," he said. "You never even threatened one. You could have brought the whole galaxy to its knees with force, and you chose silence instead. Why?" Ward considered the question for a long moment before answering. "Because you never understood what you were dealing with," he said. "You thought the threat was our weapons, our fleets, our anger. It was never any of that. The threat was simply this. We are people who cannot be owned. You can write any law you want. You can call us resources on paper. But you cannot force free people to stop being human. All we had to do was prove it. The rest," he gestured toward the signed accord on the table between them, "took care of itself." Van Tal left Earth that evening with a treaty that would reshape galactic labor law for a generation, and a lesson the Conclave would teach in its own history classes for centuries afterward. That the deepest, most unbreakable strength a people can hold is not measured in warships or weapons, but in the simple, unstoppable dignity of walking away and the quiet, patient certainty of coming back only on their own terms. Humanity had never declared war on the galaxy. It had simply reminded the galaxy what humanity was worth, and waited for the truth to do the rest.